Hey everyone, Alex here. This is ThursdAI, July 12th? Yes, July 12th. Am I confused because I'm not really here? This is a pre-recorded podcast, which is new for me because for the past year, I've been doing these podcasts live on X and then editing them into a podcast form for you, same day as we recorded the live show. And today is a little different. I'm actually flying on vacation. But I didn't want to leave you hanging. I didn't want to break my streak of a year full of podcasts. And so I decided to release some previous material that I had for you to enjoy, a few conversations. So today we'll have two conversations with three folks. First, we'll have a conversation about mixture of agents, a interesting new way similar to mixture of experts that we've talked about, which happens in the LLM world of things, but this happens in the prompt world of things. And this is a conversation with James Zhu from Stanford, who together with ThursdAI, yeah, it's funny to say this, together with ThursdAI came up with this technique called mixture of agents. And they have achieved incredible performance, as you'll hear, on AlpacaEval, which is a very hard benchmark to beat, and released a paper. And James will tell us all about mixture of agents. And luckily that week, more than one mixture of agents was released. And so I reached out to multiple authors of multiple mixture of agent implementations. And so I also hosted Kyle Corbett from OpenPipe, which is a company specializing in fine-tuning for your own models. And Kyle and the OpenPipe folks also released some work that was done separately and inspired potentially by at least the naming. That's also called Mixture of Agents. And they have beat state-of-the-art on AlpacaEval as well during the same week. So that was a crazy week. I believe this was June 20th that we recorded this conversation with James and Kyle. And it was a great conversation. If you're into prompting techniques like chain of thought reasoning, this mixture of agents is definitely a very interesting area to explore. So this episode is going to be more of an AI engineer-focused episode. The second part is an interview with Alex Atala that I recorded back in April. And I didn't post it back then because of some sound issues. And hopefully I fixed some of them. But I apologize in advance if the audio on Alex's end wasn't perfect and I wasn't able to fix it super well. However, it was a very illuminating interview. If you've never heard of OpenRouter, definitely listen to this. If you've heard of OpenRouter and used OpenRouter, even more of a reason to listen to this. OpenRouter is this incredible place where you can access any model that basically they put there. And as far as I know, this is pretty much the only place where you can access a bunch of open source models and also a bunch of frontier models like OpenAI's, Anthropic, Claude, etc., with a unified interface. And that interface also supports the OpenAI SDK interface, which, by the way, to talk our own book, because of this, it also supports Weights and Biases Weave natively, which I just added to our documentation today. But besides this, OpenRouter is this incredible place that allows you to do fallbacks for your own OpenAI, for example, quotas. And so if OpenAI gives you a quota, you can fall back to OpenRouter, for example, switching just a string in your code, which is quite incredible. And Alex previously was the CTO of OpenSea and has a lot of ideas about open source and open access, and an illuminating conversation with Alex. He was a little bit sick, but he came through anyway. And I have been sitting on this conversation for a long time, and I'm very happy that finally I had a chance to release this. So I'm really hoping that you'll enjoy both these conversations as I'm taking a much needed break and the AI is going a little bit of a hiatus from live shows. With that, I give you the first conversation with James Zhu and Kyle Corbett. All right, folks. Now I want to move towards our next kind of conversation, we have James Zhu here. I'm hoping I pronounced this correctly, and also Kyle. And we're switching gears a little bit. We're going to talk about some other news as well. James, feel free to say hi to the folks and introduce yourself. And we're going to talk about some exciting stuff from you guys from Together.
Hey, Alex, can you hear me okay?
Yes, coming through loud and clear. Welcome.
Okay, great. Thank you very much.
Feel free to introduce yourself to the folks because this is your first time on ThursdAI.
Yeah. So I'm James. I'm a professor at Stanford, where I lead a group developing AI for both foundation AI and also different applications, scientific applications. So AI for medicine and AI for science. And recently, we've been working with my collaborators at Together AI on building these sort of mixture of agent systems.
Yes, mixture of agents is the thing that I believe not this week, but probably last week was a little bit announced, or at least you guys released. I don't know how long you guys have been working on this. And I think it went under my radar. And then it started kind of popping up in multiple places. And I really wanted to talk about this and learn more. And then it just happened. Then Vipul from Together just tagged you, I believe. And I really wanted to hear more from the folks who worked on this as well. And I also, in this vein, James, maybe a surprise for you, but I'm sorry I didn't tag you in this as well. I will also introduce Kyle to the conversation because Kyle, you guys have been working on something similar as well. James, I know you have some time restrictions, so we'll start with you, and we'll love to hear from you about mixture of agents, and then we'll continue with Kyle. Kyle, so feel free to introduce yourself as well, and then we'll start with James and talk here about mixture of agents.
Sure. Yeah. Hey, everybody. My name is Kyle Corbett. I am the founder of a company called OpenPipe. We're very focused on fine tuning. And yes, we're working on something very parallel, I think, to what James is working on. Anyway, so happy to talk about it, compare and contrast that. Yeah, after you said
amazing. Thanks, Kyle. James, so back to you. Could you give us, let's start talking about, if anybody haven't heard of mixture of agents, what is this thing? What did you guys work on, and what are some of the characteristics? What is the interesting things they need to know?
Yeah, sounds good. And I'm very nice to meet you, Kyle. So the idea is that if we think about how traditional standard deep learning works, right, it comes by putting together these architectures of layers of artificial neurons, right? So layers of components where each component is a relatively simple neuron. And motivated by that, now we're thinking about building more complex architectures. We still have layers of components, but each component now, instead of being like a simple artificial neuron, but itself could be an agent. It could be, for example, like a large language model or some additional tools. And the motivation for this is that I think there's actually a lot of complementarities among different language models. So some of them are better at doing certain tasks. And if we can get them to collaborate together in different ways, then that can actually really boost substantially the capabilities of these models. So that's how we end up coming up with this mixture of agent idea. You can view that as exactly like a deep neural network, but instead of having individual neurons at each layer, now each unit is actually itself like a language model that can process more complex information. And the surprising thing we found is that when we have this mixture of agent architecture, using just open source language models, we can actually do substantially better than the latest GPT-4o across a variety of interesting benchmarks like AlpacaEval.
AlpacaEval beating. So let me get this straight. Other open source, and I think you guys used Wizard LM and Qwen 1.5 even, right? Not even Qwen 2. They are generating, so you're not doing any training. You're taking off-the-shelf open source models. You're asking them to just do regular inference, correct? And then
that's right.
How does the combination of that works that they're beating GPT-4o? Is just all of them generate? Could you dive in just a little deeper in the technicalities how they're beating GPT-4o?
Yeah. So we set up this mixture of agent architectures where imagine each of these open source models in the first layer would generate some response to the user's queries, right? And in the next layer, each of the agents there would take as inputs the aggregate of the outputs from agents in the first layer and then add their own refinement and summarization to it. And this process can iterate for multiple layers. Right? And when we see this, that after each layer, the output of those agents are starting to get better and better. So that's, if we look at the final output and compare that against with GPT-4o's output, that's where in the head-to-head comparisons like AlpacaEval will have win rates around 65%.
And those layers are in prompt land, so this is all inference and it's all prompting, correct? It's all just like inference. Yam, if you have a question, jump in here, feel free.
Yeah, I just want to stress an important point, actually 2 points. First, that it's not a little bit better. That it's not just better, it's very much more. The score is very high. It is a notable jump in performance. And moreover, Alpaca 2 is not just a benchmark. It's a really hard benchmark where I think Llama 3 gets 20%. And the score we are talking about here is, if I remember correctly, is something around 60, something like that.
Yeah.
So it's not just a jump in performance, it's 3 times. And it's a benchmark that is very hard to, you could say, trick or cheat on because it's judged by another LLM. And it does correlate to what humans think. So it's not just a benchmark like a multiple choice question. So it is a really notable jump in performance with normal, small, weaker models, you can say. So I just want to stress this point because it's important. It's huge, the way I see it.
Wow.
Yeah, thank you, Yam. That's a very useful context. And just to put the numbers, like you said, on this benchmark, for example, the latest GPT-4o would get like 57%. And our mixture of agents using only the open source models will get something like 65%, right? So it would be like quite a substantial bump above GPT-4o.
And then also empty bench score is 9.25, which is also quite incredible. That's at least what I see as well. And this is using 3 rounds as far as I'm seeing. Okay. And you've used, okay. And this is using some of the kind of, James, we're here in ThursdAI, we're following like the latest and greatest. Qwen 1.5 is an older version of Qwen 2 that we've already talked about. Yeah. But does this need the latest and greatest model in this case? Or is it okay to even use like smaller models? Could you talk about maybe it's okay to use 7 billion parameter models in this case?
Yeah, that's where I think it becomes really interesting and potentially very exciting. Is that we find that there's a lot of this phenomenon we call it collaborativeness among even the smaller models, right? Where by collaborativeness I mean that if I give like a weak model, maybe like an older model's response to a stronger model as guidance, right? The stronger model would actually do even much better now, even if it's seeing something from a much weaker model. And that what that means in practice is that the different layers that we put into this mixture of agents, they could actually consist of weaker open source models and older models that are very fast and cheap for do inference. But because of this synergy, the output actually ends up being much stronger. Now, one of the big challenges then is how to actually design these kind of layer architectures, right? Because now the components of the layers are these agents themselves. And to do this, we actually also last week released this platform that we call TextGrad, which is essentially like PyTorch, but for optimizing these AI agents, right? So you can now backpropagate instead of numerical gradients, but backpropagate text feedback to optimize these kind of agents.
I would love to maybe just a little bit more understand this TextGrad thing, if you don't mind to simplify this for me. Somebody who, what does it mean? Backpropagate something in the prompt kind of land? Maybe.
Yeah, so we think of that as exactly like analogous to PyTorch, but for agents, right? So when we traditionally try to build AI systems, the signal is sort of backpropagated through these automatic differentiations, and it's basically backpropagating numerical gradients to update the individual components. When we talk about things like mixture of agents, right, the individual components are often language models or black box tools. So we can't really update them with these numerical gradients like we would before with PyTorch. And what we did here with TextGrad is to basically update everything through text, through natural language, right? We leverage the fact that all of these agents communicate with each other through natural language. Mm-hmm. And we can basically have a chain rule as analogous for natural language to basically update each of the individual components. So that's basically the main idea of TextGrad.
Wow, that's awesome. And so you released TextGrad, 3 days ago? I think I added this now to the top of the space as well.
That's right, yes.
Could you tell me about some limitations of this that you found? I know definitely I'm thinking about maybe speed. This probably isn't as fast as GPT-4o, is it?
Yeah, so I think the speed of this mixture of agents is something we're working on. We're actually working on basically doing like a streaming version of this, right? So in the standard, the straightforward setup of this mixture of agents, you have to wait sequentially until the first layer finishes before the agents in the second layer starts to process. And that's where it becomes slow. But we're thinking about how to do this in a streaming manner so that as soon as the layers in the first agent starts to generate some response, even before it finishes, layer agents in the second layer already starts to process that. And then this can substantially reduce like the time to first token, making it very comparable to GPT-4.
Right. And yeah, so streaming could help with speed as well. And I'm trying to think of like how compute intensive this whole thing is, or how does one run this? Do these models have to maybe run at all times together, or could you like load and unload them? How do you guys like think about the compute intensiveness of something like this?
Yeah, good question. I think the nice thing here is that because we're building this mixture of agents where the individual components are actually relatively small and cheap models, right? The total inference flop of a whole three-layer mixture of agent system is actually still much less than the inference flops of just doing just using one big model like GPT-4o.
Then GPT-4o, but for folks who, let's say, aren't even thinking about running something like GPT-4o, do you need to run them in parallel? Can you run them in sequence? All these like individual layers, or I guess individual proposers, I guess you call them, right?
Yeah, good question. So I think definitely to get to the fastest experience, we run them in parallel. We run the agents in parallel,
which requires quite a few compute. So there's a few considerations there for speed and compute requirements, but the outcome looks very impressive. And also the smallest like models improvement looks very impressive. James, thank you so much for breaking this down. I think it's very impressive, given that the results are from smaller models, we can get to significantly impressive results. I appreciate your time here. I know you have like short on time. Where can folks learn more about this? And then definitely folks should follow you on Twitter. Where else can folks know more about this and follow some of your work?
Yeah, so we have a couple of blog posts and tutorials. So I'll put that into the chat.
Yes, please. And then folks definitely give James a follow. And now I want to follow up with James. Thank you so much for coming, and I appreciate your time and great work on this. And now I want to like move to the next chapter of this deep dive with mixture of agents. Sorry, not to get confused with mixture of experts, which is a whole different thing at the transformer layer. Kyle, welcome. You reached out to me, and then you guys have released something today as well that's related, and you guys worked in parallel as well. And tell me about your mixture of agents as well.
Yeah, okay, very happy to talk about that. So yes, this is something we just released this morning, about half an hour before the show. So really excited to be talking about it publicly. But yes, we've also been doing a lot of research in the general space of using more compute at inference time.
I'm so sorry to interrupt, but who's we? I think that's important.
Okay.
I didn't give you a chance to introduce yourself in OpenPipe, so please go ahead.
Yeah, so I work for a company called OpenPipe. Actually, I'm the founder of OpenPipe, and we're very focused on helping people move from GPT-4 or other closed source models to their own fine-tuned models, typically fine-tuned open source models. So that's the whole point. The purpose of our company is to make this transition really easy, to help you start deploying, if you're using, say, GPT-4 in production, to move to a smaller model that can be between 20 and 50 times cheaper and still do the job. So that's what we're focused on. And that's what motivated this research as well. When we were thinking about the problem we were trying to solve with our mixture of agents was how can we use more compute basically at inference time to get the highest possible quality output for a given response. And the reason we're interested in that is because you can then use those high quality outputs to go ahead and distill down a smaller model that is very specific to your use case and performs really well. And so that's like the flow that we describe in our own research. And I'd say the mixture of agents is one like half of the larger project. And that is basically how can we use as much compute as this prompt chain, which was through convergent evolution, very similar to what James is working on, to get the highest quality outputs we can. And then secondarily, how can we use those to then train a smaller model that performs well.
So let's talk about one and then two, right? So let's talk about one in terms of just performance. You claim SOTA on this task on Arena Hard and AlpacaEval. Is that what I'm understanding right?
Yep, that's exactly right. So yes, we're able to get a score of 68 on the AlpacaEval, and then also a score of, what was it? I think 84.8. Yeah, I think 84.8 on Arena Hard, which is the highest publicly reported results we've seen anywhere.
Wow, that's incredible. On Arena Hard, is that the LMC's Arena benchmark? Or am I confusing things?
Yes, that's the one that LMs, Chatbot Arena Hard. It's the one LMs has put out, I guess, a month or so ago at this point, I think.
What I'm hearing is if this replicates after folks like test whatever, this is like the highest reported score ever on Arena Hard. Is that what we're hearing right now?
Yep. I looked hard trying to find if anyone else had published anything else, but yes, no, I do believe it's the highest reported score.
Wow, congrats. And folks in the audience, please feel free to check us on this and check out on this. But wow, dude, congrats on this incredible performance. Okay, so this is like number one, and it looks like at least on AlpacaEval, it looks like you guys achieved fairly similar results, a little bit better results, but also like James and together, they achieved 65 in AlpacaEval. So it looks like mixture of agents does get significantly better results. What kind of models did you use? If you can say, they used WizardLM and Quen 1.5, 72B and 102B. What kind of models did you use?
Yeah, great question. And I want to call that out. I think that the research the Together team and that they're working on is really strong. I think we had a little bit different priority. On our case, is like, hey, we're going to use whatever models are best and go for maximum quality. So we just used GPT-4. We didn't use any open source models. And we're actually very interested in the other thing as well. What is the maximum performance we can get just purely using open source models? We just haven't actually published the research in that direction yet. So I think
just to recap in my head, Together MOA paper from James and Together, they used open source models, lower quality open source models together in mixture of agents to get a higher score than GPT-4o. You used GPT-4o in mixture of agents, so agents of GPT-4o to beat just like one GPT-4o also in AlpacaEval. Is that correct?
Yes, yep, that's right.
Basically, like a very smart version of prompt engineering technique to get the best possible outcome score. Okay, that's very exciting. Okay, super cool. Okay, so two kind of different angles, but the method is the same. Methodology is the same, but two kind of different use cases maybe. They're using like open source, smaller. Okay, but the next part of your stuff is very exciting. I want to hear about optimizing and getting this to be actually cheaper, because I'm assuming that if you use GPT-4o for multiple rounds or layers, as they call this, or maybe what's your approach to this, that's probably not very cheap and probably slow.
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, our architecture is slightly different. We only use a single layer because we found that there are like quickly diminishing returns. But we did inject a sort of within that layer, it's a little bit more complicated. We have an intermediate step where the model can reason about the proposed candidate completions. Anyway, so it's a little bit of a different architecture. But yes, I think the main point you made is true, which is it's slow and it's really expensive. So it's about, you have 3 times the total latency because we've got these 3 prompts, and 3 or 4 times the total cost. And for certain applications, that's actually okay. Like we definitely, even at OpenPipe, we have lots of customers that like quality is all that matters for them, and cost is not a concern. But that's not the case for most inference that's happening. Most people do care a lot about quality, and it's great to be able to run on your own hardware and everything as well. So that's the second half, which is we ran a bunch of experiments of taking the outputs from this mixture of agents pipeline, which are super strong, and then distilling them into smaller models. And so we ran across 4 different tasks. We distilled to both Llama 3 70B and then also to Llama 3 8B. And we found that in that distillation process, some of the outperformance was lost. So on our evaluations, both human evaluations we ran, and then also a larger number of LLMS judge evaluations, we found that we weren't quite able to reach the performance of our mixture of agents outputs. However, we were able to exceed, and in many cases exceed by a large margin, the performance of just calling purely GPT-4o without using the mixture of agents framework. So when we distilled down to Llama 3 70B on 4 out of 4 tasks that we tried, we were able to exceed GPT-4o's performance. And then even with our Llama 3 8B, which is obviously like a much smaller model, we were still able to exceed GPT-4o's performance on 3 out of the 4 tasks we tried. And then the 4th one, it did significantly worse.
What was the first tasks? What was? Did you get down to why was it significantly worse?
I don't know why. The actual task was basically, it's like a fantasy role play task that one of our customers has. And it was trying to summarize kind of these long role play stories into a shorter summary. And it just, Llama 3 wasn't quite as good, even when trained, as GPT-4.
Wow. All right. And you mentioned that, like, on those tasks, besides getting 3.4, 3 out of 4 tasks versus GPT-4o, it's X cheaper, which is quite ridiculous.
Yeah, so that's the really key thing. Is there's a couple of key things. One is, the price difference, and you're talking 1/25th the cost per token. Also, latency. These smaller models, just by their very nature, there's less compute involved, and we're seeing about 1/3 the latency. And then these are things you can run yourself, right? This work was all done through OpenPipe through our platform, but like when you train a model through OpenPipe, you can just export the weights. You can run inference locally or on any other inference provider, and so it gives you just a lot more control of how you do that.
That's great, man. Congrats on your work, and I'm really excited to have the folks who actually announce the things. Breaking news from today, and thank you for letting me know that you're gonna talk about mixture of agents as well. So we had a twofer, a mixture of agents, the paper from folks at Together, James and the folks at Together, and also the additional. You mentioned that you started with something else, and mixture of agents just makes sense because it's a similar thing as well. Will you?
Yeah, the name because it seemed like the architecture was very similar.
Yeah. What's next on this? I think I saw you're also you productizing this. Is there like a publishing flow, or you progress straight to production? What's next? Where can people learn more about this? Where can they use this? What's going on? Is this open source, not open source?
Yeah, so learning more, we have a tweet thread. We have like a blog post you can look just on the OpenPipe blog. I would say, the architecture it's fully open, and frankly, it's pretty simple. It's basically like you can mostly build it from what I've already described here, and certainly from the tweet thread. It's not like a separate open source library because it is pretty deeply integrated into our flow. But basically, within OpenPipe, we're using this already in a number of different services. We provide it as just a drop-in replacement for the OpenAI chat completions API. So you can just hit it with your messages and tool calls or whatever, the way you would OpenAI, and just get a higher quality response. And then we also support it basically within OpenPipe. We have data sets, all this stuff you need for fine tuning. And so we also support it if you have an existing data set or messages that you have been getting from OpenAI, you can upload them to our service and automatically relabel them with this just to get those higher quality completions. And then, of course, fine tune a model on top of it.
That's great. So congrats on this release, and folks definitely should follow Kyle. One thing that I will say, and as I continue to the next thing, thanks, Kyle, both Kyle and I are going to talk on stage next week in San Francisco. So we'll do a high five at the AI.Engineer World's Fair. I don't know when you're flying in. I'm flying in on Monday. And will you be covering this there as well?
Yeah, we'll definitely be talking about it there. Yeah, anyone who's there, definitely look me up, message me on Twitter, say hi. Excited to meet a bunch of folks.
Amazing. Thanks for the deep dive into mixture of agents, James and Kyle. Kyle, we'll see you next week as well. And I think... All right, welcome Alex Atala to ThursdAI. I think it's your first appearance here. It's been great following you around. I think I followed you way back when from the OpenSea days. Please feel free to unmute yourself and introduce yourself to this audience because it's your first time, and then we're going to chat about some interesting things you're working on lately.
Sure. Thanks, Alex. Thanks for having me. Big fan of the space. And I am CEO and co-founder of OpenRouter, which is a router for LLMs. And before that, I was the co-founder and CTO of OpenSea, at the first NFT marketplace, and started that in 2017. And before that, I had a couple small startups, one an LP thing called Apollo, where we were mostly doing sentiment analysis in 2014 and 15 on user-provided reviews for video games and for other products that kind of have early releases that a couple of people are able to play with before they hit the masses. And back then, it all basically felt like BS compared to the tech we work with today. So it's pretty exciting to just see everything that's happened in the last 2 years, and every day something crazy happens. So it's just like a wild roller coaster.
Absolutely. So thanks for coming up. And I've been, I think, following you from the OpenSea days. And then I think when I started actually noticing your, I don't know if transition to call it, but definitely more interest was around window.ai, which was reminding me of what MetaMask is. If folks never heard about Window AI. Could you give like a brief thing of what it was and like what were you trying to solve there?
Yeah, so this was like the first sort of public experiment I worked on when I started playing around with AI stuff at the end of 2022, early 2023. And it was a Chrome extension. It is still functional. And it basically lets you use your AI models or your choice of model in web apps that directly interface with it instead of calling an API themselves. So there was one major problem that it was built to solve that was in the short term. And that was all these projects that kept popping up. Do you remember like at the end of 2022, early 2023, everybody was making these bring your own key or really like short-lived indie projects that like use GPT-3 to make a cron job, or there were some little games like Turkish Carpet Salesman where you try to convince a guy to buy a carpet for as low of a price as you could.
To prompt engineer him into giving you a free carpet.
These projects were not sustainable. They're really fun. But like people making them just had such high margin or such high overhead from AI costs. And to make them sustainable, to make them actually stay up, they had to convert them into bring your own key setups where you like paste in your OpenAI key. And that also wasn't sustainable because I don't know if you remember this, but I think this is still the case now. When you like sign up for OpenAI, it won't give you access to GPT-4 and your rate limits are really bad until you build a little bit of reputation with your credit card. Now they've switched to credits. So things have changed, but it's always been a mess to bring your own key somewhere. And we tried to fix that by first making a way for people to choose the model. So if you have a really good setup somewhere and a website just wants to use AI wherever it comes from, the site can just call window.ai.generate text, and the Chrome extension would inject this provider into the web page. This is how MetaMask works with like 3 apps. You get this injected object with functions on it, and web apps can call those functions, and that means they don't have to be dependent on any APIs. So you can create a fully decentralized app on IPFS, for example, that doesn't need any backend at all. And it can just use this front-end standard. So that let people use local models. The earliest was Alpaca running locally on web apps for the first time, I noticed. And then but we realized people really want to use larger models, and people really wanted to try out things that Anthropic was developing. So we built OpenRouter as a unified API to access all of these things without worrying about rate limits.
So just before we get into
major
sorry to interrupt, but I really want to like focus on Window AI, just like recap, because I found it super interesting. MetaMask saves me as a user because like I'm basically the backend, right? There's the front end that runs whatever, and then MetaMask is on my browser. And this is the same idea for LLMs as well. Instead of me pasting my token, God knows where the developer that created this app sends it on the backend, saves it, whatever. I basically have a secure way to provide my own LLM that also could be like GPT-3 that the developer intended, right? And then you like the developer basically interacts with my whatever LLM endpoint via kind of a proxy. And what you're saying is, and I didn't connect these pieces until now, that in order to build this, you had to build like a unified way to call LLMs, which then is now basically OpenRouter. Is that, am I understanding this correctly?
Didn't need to build that. Ended up building that to help people with rate limits and with LLM discovery, and to help with like new open source models that were coming out, but just too hard to run yourself locally. But Window AI works with your own OpenAI API key and your own Anthropic keys and Cohere keys, etc. It like the onboarding was really difficult for apps. Like an app that like integrated Window AI for a really new user had to teach them, you need to set up Window AI yourself and configure your keys in the Chrome extension, and then you're good to go. So OpenRouter was just a way of skipping that whole step for apps.
Awesome. So now let's talk about OpenRouter, because I think it's like very exciting. And I will say, OpenRouter, maybe let me ask you, how do you present OpenRouter to folks? And then I can like chime in what I found exciting about OpenRouter and why I called you here.
We try to present it as a way of discovering and trying out new models that emerge. It's like the primary goal. So you land on the page, we show you trending models that have been getting more action over the past couple of days. We show you an app leaderboard for all the apps that opt in to sharing their statistics. And then you go to the rankings page, openrouter.ai/rankings, and you can see all models ranked by how much they're used, and including fast growing ones. So if you go to that now, you can see like Llama 3 fine tunes ranking really high, Llama 3 instruct 70 billion nitro ranking pretty high. And then it like lets you explore what model, how much models are being used and which apps are using them and what kinds of apps those are. We're aiming to develop this a lot further to show you like what categories of prompts different models are really popular with and how like high retention users are with certain models for certain kinds of use cases. The other thing that we do is we try to help developers with a single API that lets them access way more models and automatically reroute requests that fail for a certain provider. For new models especially, most providers just under-provision them. And there's a lot of crazy traffic. It's really difficult to load balance this traffic. Batch sizes, like batch depths change for if you're running an inference engine so quickly that it's really hard to know whether you can like sustain a bunch of traffic coming in. And it's also really slow to scale up. So it's not like Google Cloud or CPUs where you can scale up really quickly and cheaply. It takes a bit. What we do is we try to, now we have a lot more work around load balancing and the providers showing some degradation. We reroute requests to fallback providers. And we also do a lot of feature routing. If you're trying to get rarer features, samplers for having more control over your replies, then we route you to providers that support those features because they all support different subset of LLM features and some custom ones. Basically, TLDR model discovery and like a better universal API for hundreds of models.
I want to focus on thank you for that, definitely like a clear explanation. I want to focus on the universal thing. So I think maybe you guys are one of the first folks who took advantage of this OpenAI SDK feature where you can provide a different URL. And basically, instead of going to OpenAI, this would go like to a different thing, and then standardized around the OpenAI kind of standard message format standard, which we then saw natively get supported by other folks. Like Grok, when they came out, they supported this like almost natively, and now I think they even prefer this. And I think even Anthropic has their own SDK, but Anthropic also switched to the messaging format as well. Just for folks who don't develop with these apps or maybe don't remember, previously every way of interacting with these models, with these big providers, but also small providers, was like every way was different. And so you guys are like, you have your own way of interacting with OpenRouter, but also it's a drop-in replacement, which is changing one line. And for folks who like previously worked with GPT-3, for at least the messaging completion API. And I think that's like super cool because it does let a developer like me to very easily like switch between different models. Can you tell me if you guys support some of the more advanced stuff that they have? Vision recently, like all these models became like VLLMs, etc., uploading files, or even like the more advanced stuff like the Assistance API, for example.
Yeah, we support multimodal requests now for multimodal models. You can attach images to requests. And basically what we do is every Anthropic and Gemini and OpenAI all have different APIs for accepting images and for sometimes for just doing the messages list. And we normalize around OpenAI's interface and we converge to all the other interfaces behind the scenes. And same for streaming requests. We like make everything look like an OpenAI streaming response. And we found that, yeah, it definitely significantly uses integration efforts, but also makes it a little just less burdensome to switch your model and to try out new ones. And we really think that the future is going to have thousands of models that all, like a lot of them will be just very good at like niche, unique things. Like Mistral, large is the world's best French model. But like, are you going to, what are you going to do about that? Are you going to have a like whole new code base for calling Mistral that like only applies for French users when something is going on in your app? It makes sense. I think most have a really clean code that's just all oriented around one standard. And really credits go to OpenAI for this. Like ChatML was really good. It's like great foresight on their part for helping like normalize the prompting of models. And they weren't even making crazy prompt formats, but ChatML was like a simple and straightforward enough format that you can make it work with crazy prompt formats. There's a ton.
Yeah.
And Llama 3 introduced a new one. But no one needs to know or worry about those formats if they can just use the same API all the time.
So question for you as a follow-up for this. So you basically, OpenRouter is a proxy for the hosted models, but also like open models. Who decides on which backends you support? Is that you guys, or can, I don't know, like Together or whoever else apply to also be there? You're basically like functioning, after a lot of people like start using this, is basically functioning as like a marketplace for LLM calls or tokens, essentially, because you make it very easy to switch, which I find like very good for democratization. But then also, who gets to participate in this marketplace? Could you speak about like how that process is happening?
Yeah, so we started very conservative with the suppliers of the marketplace, with just a handful, like OpenAI, Anthropic, Together, and Google and Mistral. And we've been expanding it and changing our thinking as we go. Now you can see more indie inference companies appear on OpenRouter. Like we just added Novita and a new one called Lin that is just for one model, but like one Llama 3 fine-tuned that the model creator's been working on. And they made it CCNA4, so you have to get permission to host it. But like his idea is that I think like he wants to create a business around it, being an inferencer and just using OpenRouter as a distributor. So that's where we've seen like our value appear the most, is that in helping get distribution and improve the developer experience for a really large number of inferencers that are also going to appear in the future. So now we have 24 or so different companies that we help distribute for. And what we do is we make sure that they're running the actual models they say they are. It's somewhat of a trust basis right now until we have zero knowledge proofs working for AI models. And we're sitting on the hopes that's coming, but we just don't know when. And then we're gradually like improving our tooling and tolerance for new providers by building like increasingly better load balancing tech to help us reroute when a provider starts to get slow or go down.
So that's my next follow-up, because I'm looking at some of the like top this week model. You have Anthropic Claude Haiku, and it says self-moderated, which I would love to ask you what that's about. But if a developer doesn't necessarily plan to maybe change the models, I think what you're just presenting as a good idea of like why use OpenRouter instead of like directly Anthropic. But don't you get like rate limited by Anthropic on behind the scenes? Because you're essentially, and by you OpenRouter, it's a reseller of the service essentially, right? Because I basically provide credits on your platform, and then you're providing credits like behind the scenes to Anthropic. Did you get like rate limits from those platforms enough that you start to fall back to different providers, different ways? Tell me more about kind of the struggles of building something like this while the platforms themselves maybe don't know how to scale very well.
Yeah, so I mean, we also get rate limited, but we handle these rate limits by falling back to their providers really quickly, so that developers don't have to like worry about that at all. You're just trying to build your app, not worry about fallbacks. And like a provider like OpenAI is a fallback to Azure, and you can just like Azure doesn't have all the OpenAI models. That's probably the biggest strain, is that if we get like a surge of traffic to a new model that doesn't exist on Azure, we will be limited in whatever negotiated rate limit we have with the main provider. So we're working on that, and that's a tough problem. So I see a bit more a clear path forward for open source models, where if we get rate limited by the best two providers, it's pretty easy for us to fall back to the others because there's a ton of there's a lot more basically market depth. It's like a normal marketplace where like a surge in demand for some fungible product, you need like a deeper order book to serve it. So basically we're hoping that for models for providers like OpenAI and Anthropic, the order book will grow with partnerships that they do, Azure, AWS Bedrock. And we can just keep pushing upwards the amount of the maximum depth we can get.
So you're behind the scenes, you're going to go to AWS, go to whatever Anthropic kind of sells their services. And for developers on your platform, even if Anthropic kind of rate limits or goes down, the experience while using Open Router is going to be seamless. That's what I'm hearing, which is awesome.
We're aiming for it, yeah.
That's awesome. I want to follow up about like the charts that you have. So one of the outcomes that you have there is analytics. And I think recently, as we were deciding to speak with you about this, and I'm very happy that you came on because I really like the idea. I want to expose this to more folks, specifically because, for example, because of the drop-in replacement for the OpenAI API, people have been using Open Router models or models that like exist on Open Router, doesn't exist elsewhere, in some tools that support this as well. And tools support this because enterprises can decide that they're not going to OpenAI, they want to go to Azure. So like that feature in OpenAI API that lets you access like different URLs is basically like for maybe started with maybe Azure, but now like Open Router like plugs neatly into this. And so this now lets me to try something else besides OpenAI. So for example, for Cursor, or for like other models or other products that allow me to access OpenAI stuff, I can go directly to Open Router and try Mistral or try this next thing. And so model discovery now becomes important. So one thing that I just noticed that I haven't heard before, that the top model this year on the Open Router platform is Mythomax 13B. And we're reporting about models every week. I have never heard about this one. Was that like a surprising outcome of running this, or did you guys plan on like also surfacing and discovery as well? And also
Mythomax is
sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, Mythomax is a really interesting one. It's a merge of several models. It's a merge of merges based on Llama 13B, Llama 2 13B. And it was like one of the earliest, it's called like a Fragen merge, where you take two models and graph them together and you get a lot of the abilities of both. It was one of the first big successes. When it came out, we noticed that it was really good at role play. It was getting really, really good back from the local LLM community that was trying it out locally. So we added it, and it started to become like the best brand for role play use cases. It's not censored, and it turned out to be pretty well hosted. A lot of different companies added support for it. So we have a deep organization and really good rate limits as a result. And it's just, I think it came out in July of last year. So it's been around for quite a while, maybe August last year. And it just surged. We're like, it may get dethroned in the near future. I think it will likely get dethroned with something based on Mistral or Llama 3. But you'll see though, if you go to the apps under Mythomax, it's primarily role play use cases that it's really good for.
I've never heard about this model, but like the discovery feature of this is like a super cool as well. And also just the kind of the volumes that you process. I think you posted recently that you just passed like 60 billion. Is that like the graphs are insane, the growth as well in usage of this. And I guess the discovery of who uses them, I think it's a big one. So I definitely saw that friends of ours, News Research, they came like to the top of the leaderboards there with WorldSim for a while. Can you tell me about, do you discover like new cool use cases for LLMs just because people use them on Open Router, or is this another aspect of this marketplace where like actually user, because you have like multiple aspects. You have the developers who use the tokens, providers who provide different, like providers provide the same models. You spoke about open models being better for this use case because then they can get cross-hosted about like everybody can host them as they want. But also you now have apps that use them. So you have a multifaceted marketplace, which I find fascinating. Talk to me about the application side of this, like how we see who uses them. How do you know if that, do I have to expose my app if I use Open Router? I would love to some clarity over that.
Yeah, the apps are one of my favorite parts about this. No, you don't have to expose your app. Use Open Router. You just don't include a header, the X title header, and we won't show your app up in the showcase. But for people who do, it's a really good way of getting exposed and letting people discover you. And we tend to refer a lot of users right from our homepage that way. But it's also just one of my favorite parts. I discover like crazy stuff all the time by looking at fast growing apps that everyone can find straight on the homepage. One that I'm particularly excited about that's been in the top like 10 or so for the last week is WebSim, which lets you simulate the web using a simulated browser. I think it's ranked 8 right now. And you can like just go and make up a website that doesn't exist or make up a website that does. And it will like, most of it uses Cloud 3 behind the scenes. It will generate the web page that it thinks is at that URL. And you can go look up your name, see what it generates for you or for your company that you work at, and generate the links to things that it thinks might exist. It's really fun. And there's a lot of stuff like Infinite Worlds is trending now. Different kind of UIs for role play. Vox does cool. It's like a speech-driven AI companion that you can talk to and has a 3D model that you're interacting with. So all this rich app, AI app experience I've always wanted, a place where I could just discover cool things by a metric that I just hadn't seen anywhere in the AI space, which is how much is it being used, really? And like, what models is this usage actually happening on? So we try to help users answer these questions, and developers who want to expose that stuff and get them a place to expose it and get traffic.
I think the fact that you're exposing and then it brings people traffic is like very cool as well. WebSim is definitely, we haven't talked about WebSim. I think it's an outcome of a hackathon in San Francisco, and I don't remember the guy's name, but I know Rob maybe? Yeah, Rob something. And WebSim is like very interesting how fast it took off and how much people love like to just like generate websites. Rob Hatfield maybe? Yeah, so Alex, like on the top of the app showcase, the fact that you're sending traffic is really cool. What are your plans for the kind of the app discovery aspect of this? Because like you're saying, you're enjoying like discovering yourself, you're sending traffic. There's could be a lot more to get built there because people actually see what other people use. What are some plans around the app showcase?
It's really simple. It's just descriptions, names, and favicons, basically. So we're thinking about building that out. A request that we get really frequently is just being able to see more than the top 20 apps per day or apps per week, and on models as well. And another request we get a lot is just, it's not super app related, but seeing like basically category breakdown for a model, which categories of prompts are really trending the most. And for a given category, like role play, what are the best in models? Tentative plan, and this is like halfway built right now, is to build a really good role play ranking on Open Router. Because role play has had just a tough time getting, I think, a definitive way of ranking models for it. And because it's a bit arbitrary, it's hard to make an eval that actually doesn't get consumed by fine tuning for it. And so there's no trusted eval for it. There's some ELO-based rankings for role play, but it's hard for me to grok. And some of the models I just don't think anyone uses the models that get ranked in some of these rankings that I've seen. We're trying to build a much better role play ranking and then have the apps get distribution in all of these things. Whenever you see, we want apps to get discovered as much as possible because it's just one of the richest parts of having a marketplace.
Absolutely. Alex, a follow-up that's sidestepping the apps use case, but for developers of apps. So a lot of these, and I assume like for a lot of these, I don't know how many of them are businesses, but a lot of these are like Silly Tavern, for example. I think it's open source, and other places that are open source. Like it makes perfect sense to use something like Open Router and just tell people, hey, register on Open Router with your own API key and provide this here. Like it makes sense for them to also to be able to switch between models as they come out. And we follow with every model that comes out. We talk about this on ThursdAI, and it's really cool to see like how fast OpenRoute updates them as well. For the more business and enterprise use case, potentially, you're basically a router for all tokens and all information as well. And then the question of security comes up. And the question of do you see the data comes up and all of these things. Could you talk about that aspect of how you treat this, especially coming from the decentralized crypto space? And like your first thing you talked about here was MetaMask was like, and Window AI was like fully on my end and no servers exist, etc. Could you speak about that aspect and how you think about like the security and the fact that you are handling potentially sensitive data that goes between you, the user, and the eventual kind of Anthropic or OpenAI, etc.?
Yeah, it's a good question. First of all, we have a little checkbox that you can check on your account page for OpenRouter on whether or not you want to share prompts with OpenRouter, which we pay you for. Like you get a 1% discount when you do. We just believe that like user data is valuable, it can be valuable, and you should get compensated in some way. And we only use that data to build our auto router that automatically picks a model for you based on your prompt, and also to help you discover new models based on a certain category of prompt. The underlying providers themselves, it's pretty crazy. This is really different from crypto in general. You have to read the terms of service over and over again for all the AI providers to figure out what they do with your data, how long it's stored as a log, whether it's logged just in flight in memory or stored anywhere, if there's a retention policy on it. And it seems to vary pretty widely. We found that like almost all providers seem to take it pretty seriously, and we don't train on your prompts or your data. For providers that do think they might want to train on prompts, we pretty much always find that they are willing to discount prices for it. So we ship the discount fully to users if that happens, and we let users opt out of those providers completely. So you'll just uncheck that one thing on your OpenRouter account, all those providers disappear.
I'll just say users here, you mean users of OpenRouter, like developers, not the end users of their platforms.
Developers.
Yeah.
Developers, so like the users, it's both. Yes, like prompts that are sent to OpenRouter get routed to these AI providers. The AI provider usually has a way of opting out of data collection, and we either turn that on by default if there's no price differential, so there's no data collection, or we let users get rid of that provider if they don't have data collection to happen. And then there's some cases like OpenAI, they store prompts for 30 days. And basically we just try to find this information, find links about it, surface this in the provider's list, the seller's list for a model to just help developers do research on it. So it's like we're trying to make it a better central location for privacy related like info. And it's a do your own research solution right now, but very open to feedback about it.
Yeah, I think that's very important, especially given that the kind of the end users may not necessarily like know about this and whose job it is to actually like reply and who actually stores the prompts in the middle. Definitely very interesting. There's a bunch of models that are 100% off that you offer for $0. Could you walk me through the business case of this? Because obviously, like we know, just like an aside here, we know that ChatGPT is now open. 3.5 is free even without registration. I think many models, when they come out, they want like RLHF, they want the people to like vote, etc. I don't believe that you have any of that algorithm. But maybe correct me if I'm wrong, but I haven't seen any feedback that I as a developer can provide OpenRouter and say, hey, for Mythomist, which you now offer for free, this prompt worked better, this prompt worked worse. So walk me through the 100% discount model usage, which is very interesting.
Yeah, we really wanted to give people a way of trying out models for free when they sign up. I just really believe in the try before you buy mentality, or at least ability for a new product that's emerging like VR. And so I think like many months ago, we started offering a couple models 100% discounted. And most of these are 7 billion parameter models. So they're the lower cost to run. And we basically pay the providers in full for them, but we just take the loss for people trying them out. And our thinking around them is that they're pretty heavily rate limited. They're called free variants. So if you go to a model page, you see a little free button on it, and go get it like a more rate limited version of it, and you just pull around with it for free. Our thinking is that the loss that we take that like made up for in the 0.6-ish% fee that we have when we add credits and the volume discounts that we get from providers that we split with users. So it's not a loss that I think drives us in the red. We think it's an acceptable thing to give. And we try to add new free variants for interesting new models. Last one we did was Gemma, I think. And for Copy and Mythomist that are like pretty popular with certain kind of use cases.
Yeah, I definitely see that. I see like joining an app, especially as a developer, joining a provider is like, hey, most of them together gives $20 for free, etc. Most of them give something out because even just building with this, I don't want to put up a cracker straight up, but I definitely appreciate this. Alex, last question before I let you go, and thank you so much for coming here. Obviously, with your background in OpenSea and crypto and kind of like that ethos, you briefly mentioned something about ZK proofs, the ability to know which model runs actually, which provider runs which model and actually runs it. Could you give me more of a glimpse of like how you see those kind of two areas kind of joining, being like very prominent in the previous one as well? Do we see a convergence point going forward in some of the more distributed, decentralized, and zero knowledge like areas to join this AI area where like my data is very interesting, but also provenance of data that was used to train these models is very interesting. Where your like gut currently lies in like the inflection between AI and crypto?
Yeah, so you got the big limiting, I think the biggest limiting factor right now for decentralized AI is that you don't know what model someone is running for in a decentralized system. And you can rate them based on their replies. You can have like a voting system, but no AI model, I think, is good enough to get good votes all the time. If you're really running Llama 3 billion, you're going to get lots of bad votes, even though you might be running the real model. And I just think there's quite a lot of difficulty in setting up a good decentralized system right now without proofs. That's not to say it's a bad idea to try. There's a lot of really promising protocols coming out, that's Morpheus and Ritual. And our thinking is that we want to focus on distribution and load balancing. So we think that those are pretty underrated but massive problems. And we think that solving those problems really well now will mean that we can just route traffic to decentralized AI protocols when they're ready, when it feels like, oh, maybe if it's an brief, you can prove that you're running a model efficiently and quickly for every output. Then suddenly everybody can like quickly spin up a provider on OpenRouter through protocols that work well. And our load balancer will only give them traffic that they can handle. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. So we'll wait and see the convergence of this. There's a bunch of issues, but hopefully at least some more around the privacy stuff will get solved. Some use cases as well. Maybe last thing, although I promised already a last thing, the name Open Router. What is the open aspect of this? And yeah, could you talk about like the open aspect of this, or is this like OpenAI where they started with open and then they pivoted?
Yeah. So our initial thinking was that we wanted it was Open Router because we were adding open source models Like, it was going to be like the best way of accessing open source models in one place across lots of providers. We also then made an open source inferencer. So OpenRouter, fun fact, hosts a bunch of models, and it was made a VLLM based setup and open sourced it, and just been like building it out gradually. And what our thinking is that we want to open source more chunks gradually, especially ones that dive deeper into AI inference and help providers start businesses and improve the businesses they have. Lynn, I think, is a really cool example. To my knowledge, they're not using our open source repo, but they've just set up their own inferencer. They're incorporating, they fine-tuned Llama 3, extended to 24K context, which is awesome. They made it better at role play. They've been getting a lot of traffic. They use OpenRouter for distribution.
Could you say their name again? Sorry, just for the record.
So
Lynn.
if you go to Llama 3 Soliloquy 8B, Soliloquy, but if you go to the rankings and look at the fastest growing model right now, it's Soliloquy by Lynn. And the weights are on Hugging Face. Like, the key is that this is like someone who just fine-tuned it and wants to make the API for it too, and actually like use another service or find GPUs, lots of different ways of doing that, and just leverage OpenRouter as a distributor. So I'm a big fan of that approach, and we want to open source tech that just helps people do that more.
That's awesome. So Alex, thank you so much for coming up. I am a fan of OpenRouter, specifically the ability to like super quickly switch between different models for other use cases, like Cursor, for example, and like other things, but also the app exposure. I think it's like super cool to just see apps that I wouldn't have otherwise checked. And the follow-up as well in the vibes check category, which is how we evaluate whatever models. We follow from week to week. We see all these like models. We see the regular evals that everybody runs automatically. But one very important vibe check is like how many people are actually using them and where and which apps. So it's a great way to use that. Obviously, it's restricted to the people who only use OpenRouter, but still seeing highlights of the open source like ranking, like Lynn, for example, is very interesting as well. So thank you for coming up. Anything else you want to plug or leave before you go? Definitely the stage is yours. Feel free to say anything you want. And then we're going to follow up with a bit more news and then we'll let folks go.
Yeah, WorldSim and Lynn, I think, are both two cool things to check out. WorldSim, again, is like a really interesting app that uses multiple models and builds like a unique user experience. We really want to enable more of those. There just aren't that many great user experiences that have been built, direct-to-user experiences that have been built on top of AI so far. And we really want to make those easier to make. I didn't mention we have an OAuth system that some apps use, like Novel Crafter uses it really well, so that you can not pay for AI at all. They build an app that's direct to user, but users sign in with OpenRouter, and then they get access to all 140 models that users pay for themselves, including our free ones that no one has to pay for except us. And just you can use more apps that way and build apps that are more sustainable. We're trying to enable more of that and encourage these, and also encourage new models that are very niche and good at specific things like Soliloquy and Trimble Letter and a couple others that we've added recently. Explore around. There's a playground to play with, to chat and play with things yourself. And please give us feedback. We have a Discord where we sometimes act on feedback the day it's given. And thanks for having me.
Awesome. Thanks for coming up. And definitely folks should check out OpenRouter, or at least know of its existence when you eventually need to do something with the fallback as well. And I've seen like many new models like pop up super quick as well. So it's great to see that there's also the ability to play around with them with a unified API. Thanks, Alex, for coming.